Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kabingara wash processed Kenya from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. There's the bag right there. And Manhattan, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And no need for an introduction, as they're one of our most featured roasters on this channel, and that's because they're one of my favorite coffee roasters in the entire world. So I was very excited to see them release a Kenyan coffee for the first time since 2021. In fact, we reviewed both Kenyan coffees that they released that year, including both the Karatina as well as the Kianjege, with the Kianjege remaining my favorite washed Kenyan coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel. So it's safe to say the expectations for this one were very high, and we will see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was similar to our standard Manhattan recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind, but with this coffee we went even more fine than normal on that grind. Now, roast profile for this one, Manhattan is notorious for roasting very light, and some of their coffees come out on the lighter side of that as well. This is another one of those coffees, as it did remind me a little bit of that Felipe Contreras Gesha that we've also reviewed, which is to say that even by their standards, it's on the slightly more light side of things. So this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60 and had a pretty mixed start, as there was a little bit of a Kenyan-like aspect to it, but in a much more subtle sense, with the light profile of the coffee being a little bit more present than the brightness, as there's a subtle citric aspect, but interestingly enough, maybe not quite the level of brightness that we might have expected for a Kenyan coffee, as the entirety of this cup came out a little bit more soft in general. So it left an okay first impression, and I was kind of miffed by that first start. We continue on to day 17, and this time we opted for the Chemex, and it still continues to remain not quite as bright as initially expected, with a continuously lighter profile to it. It does open up a little bit more, with the notable characteristics being this intermediary berry and this extremely subtle stone fruit aspect. Other than that though, a very tame coffee in general, so not entirely sure what to make from these first two impressions, but we continue on to day 20. Ran it through the April brewer, and the cup feels like it just might need a lot more time's rest, as it still doesn't quite offer the Kenyan brightness that was initially expected from it, with the entire cup defined more by potential than anything that's actually directly felt within the cup itself. Much more of a lemon water forward cup with a very slight peachy aspect to it than anything else. So very tame, very delicate, very light right from the start. So we continue on to day 22. Adjusted to our Manhattan recipe with a more fine of a grind, and it continues to come out very light in several aspects, with more of that light lemon water base still present and a very slight savoriness to complement that too. Coffee continues to remain just very subtle in general, so there are a lot of issues I was having with this one all the way up to this point. We continue on to day 26, more of the same, as some heavy adjustments might still be needed as it continues to remain very light and tame, this time with the same adjustments through the Chemex. Everything with this one just has a very delayed finish, with the focus continuing to be on this lemongrass forward profile, a very faint savoriness as well as some berry attributes, but those are mostly lingering on the palate, with a very subtle grainy peachy component too, so still struggling a lot with this one. We continue on to day 30, and in even more fine of a grind, even higher temperatures, extended rest, and there's been a fair bit more to the cup, as it's the best it's been up to this point. A little bit of the fruit has opened up with a slight bit more fruit sweetness, but for the most part it was a little reminiscent of what I would describe on this day as being a yuzu gummy, which is of course a little bit more of a citric gummy sense, but even then it was slightly more tame in general, with a little bit more of that listed peachiness. Even then, still pretty subtle. Better, but there's a moderate relative to the expectations. There's a moderate aspect to it relative to the expectations going into it. Day 37, back through the Chemex one more try, and with the same adjustments, it's improved a little through this brew method as well, as it's skewing a bit in the direction of just citric brightness, some generic citric brightness, with the cherry a little bit more pronounced as it's offering a bit more of the Kenyan savoriness. And even at this point, the Kenyan savoriness that's present in this one has also been quite subtle, so not necessarily experiencing a lot of those attributes. For the most part, just another okay day. Day 40, final notes we have, one more try through the Chemex, and it's been pretty consistent in the sense that it's offering a slight bit more of a citric forward cup. As the previously mentioned, bright yuzu is the strongest component to it. Even then, with as strong as it is within the coffee, the entire thing just remains delicate, tame, and subtle. It's just strong relative to a lot of the other features in this one. Berry and stone fruit both remain more faint, as it does have a slight, long-lasting savory aspect to it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 4. And that's kind of interesting. It is on the low side of level 4, and I've said for a very long time that I would be very surprised if a Kenyan coffee does not reach minimum level 4 in terms of the finish. This one actually kind of struggled to reach that level 4 in the finish because the entire cup from start to finish was very faint, delicate, and tame. So this one right here, it barely reached that level 4 mark, which is kind of surprising. Same thing with the acidity. The acidity also, it didn't have the sort of Kenyan brightness that you might expect, that very strong, defining acidic component that you just go into Kenyan coffees fully expecting. It wasn't quite there, and I also said I'd be really surprised if a Kenyan coffee doesn't reach that minimum level 4. This one also barely reached the minimum level 4, so both of these things were definitely on the lower side of the level 4. Even then I said they're present enough, there's enough of a finish, there's enough of a brightness to justify the level 4 mark. It is pushing it a little bit. Honestly, I would be fine if either of those finished on the higher side of level 3. Citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, and I had mentioned yuzu being maybe the most pronounced characteristic for me in this one. Outside of that, I think they have a lemon note list on here. It's a little bit of a, I would say, generic citrus, but honestly for me, I think there was enough definition to kind of align it with the flavor profiles that we've listed. Even then, it's only on level 4 because the rest of this coffee was tame, and as we're going through the tasting wheel, you'll kind of see that demonstrated in the other things in this tasting wheel. But citrus fruit, level 4, not necessarily overly pronounced, just more pronounced relative to some of the other things in this tasting wheel. We have a lot of level 3s. We'll actually start with the bitterness, level 3. Yes, and that's the citric component because the citric component is on the slightly more bitter side of things. As mentioned, it's kind of that yuzu aspect to it, that lemon aspect, and it's a slightly more bitter side of that too. So level 3, yes. Savoriness, level 3. I don't think it necessarily helps that the finish for me did skew a little bit more in that savory direction, that infamous T word. So that in itself isn't going to help, especially since this coffee to begin with is relatively more tame and moderate. Body, level 3. It still has a little bit of that Kenyan-like body to it, and that could be a number of factors, including the fact that we opted for the V60 with this, the fact that we went a little bit more fine on the grind too, but for the most part, yeah, nothing really stood out in terms of the body either for this one. Cleanliness, level 3. Yes, it's in theory, I would say a cleaner cup of coffee, but I've always said that if the savoriness is going to score a level 3, it's going to be very hard for the cleanliness to go any higher than that level 3 mark. So it did have a bit of those savory aspects to it. In addition to that, while the citric attribute may have been a little bit more defined, nothing else in this coffee was that well defined for me. So I think it's a little tricky on that. Level 3 does seem right for this one. Sweetness, level 3. If I'm being completely honest, this is maybe even on the more generous side of the sweet aspects to it because it's either right there at that level 3 or maybe even on the lower side of the level 3. As far as I can recall, this might be one of the least sweet coffees I've ever had from Manhattan in my entire life, and that's interesting in itself. What I've said right from the start to this one was a lot more tame and delicate than I might have expected going into it. So sweetness, level 3, that's very worst lower side of the level 3. Florality, level 3. Yes, and I think it goes in line with the rest of this coffee, that this entire coffee being more tame and delicate. The floral components are able to stand out slightly more, and that's going to be, of course, a little bit more of those red floral aspects to it, a little bit of the herbality, so I could see it being a little bit more in line with something like that hibiscus, but even then, more tame in general. Berry fruit, level 3. They do have a cherry note list on here. Interestingly, I would say that was a little bit more pronounced than what you might typically expect from Kenyan coffees, that of course being those more tart berry aspects to them. Those weren't necessarily overly pronounced or prominent, and I think that's one of the main reasons why the acidity wasn't quite as bright as I might have expected, so that felt a little bit more dialed back. Stone fruit, level 3. A little bit generous on that level 3 as well. I was able to get very faint traces of peach with this one from time to time. Even then, it wasn't necessarily the most pronounced thing, but since this tasting wheel is all relative compared to a lot of the other things in it, it can score as high as it did. But as I'm kind of looking at this tasting wheel, I don't think that there's too much else to add. I think that it's actually a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I'm going to start from the beginning and just put this one on myself and say that it's entirely possible that this one was barista error, but I really struggled with this coffee. This is the coffee I've struggled with the most that we've ever reviewed from Manhattan. That does include the anaerobic natural processed coffees or the heavier processed coffees that we've reviewed from Manhattan. Because even if I didn't like those coffees, I kind of knew what they were, I kind of knew what to expect, and I felt like I did get what those coffees were supposed to be. When it came to this one, I feel like I was way off base. I feel like I didn't even come close to what this coffee is supposed to be. One anecdote I did want to add to this coffee is I actually tried the espresso roast of this one on batch brew, and I found out that I liked that one a lot more than I liked this coffee. So if they maybe developed that one a little longer, which naturally you might expect if that's an espresso blend, then I feel like this coffee actually just needed a fair bit more time, as this one right here, it did feel a little underdeveloped for me, if I'm being completely honest, and I think that's a lot of the reason I did struggle with it as much as I did. I just couldn't pull out a lot of factors in this one, a lot of aspects in this one, so I'm going to put the blame on me, but I do think that this coffee may have had a lot more potential to it, and I think that espresso roast that I tried of it did demonstrate that, as it did give me a little bit more vibrancy to it in general, whereas this one just came out very tame, very delicate. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards with this one to start out with. It doesn't really offer anything in a very heavy direction. If anything, it keeps the entire palate of this one on the more tame side of things. It does offer maybe a little bit more of a citric component to it in a very light profiled coffee, light profiled in a lot of aspects. Flavor profile, the roast profile, just the entire clarity, the definition of this one, all of those things remain very light. So keep a very light-minded profile for this one in mind with a little bit of a citric direction as well. But I honestly think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I would definitely love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. Did you struggle with this one as much as I did? Because I was just kind of surprised by the results on this one. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kabingara wash processed Kenya from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.